Council on Global Affairs. On behalf of the Council, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent and nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent the Council. We'll get right down to business today so that you can make your Metro trains, your CTA trains on the way home, but if you drove, sorry, we will end right at rush hour. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. The event is on the record, and we encourage quiet tweeting and other social mediating during the event. Later, we will take questions through microphones in the room or through our browser-launched app, which you can find at chi.cnf.io. You won't remember those letters. They will be on both screens throughout. Thank you for silencing that. Appreciate it. Please note, Graham Allison's new book will be available for signing and purchase after the program from our partners at the bookseller. Finally, I'd like to thank the Dover Corporation for their continued support of our China's Changing Landscape series. To say a few more words about the topic today and to welcome our speakers, I invite to the stage David Weinberg, Chairman and CEO of Jet Enterprises and President Circle Member of the Council. Thanks, David.
Well, good afternoon, and on behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, welcome. You've heard who I am. I have the honor of serving on the International Council of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. That council is chaired by today's speaker, Graham Allison. Graham's resume is longer than the average undergraduate term paper, so I will only hit the highlights. From his first book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, through many books and articles about international relations, nuclear proliferation, and now his current book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Graham has led the way in the use of historical analysis as a guide to policymaking. He was the founding dean of the modern Kennedy School of Government and is responsible for training many of the world's leaders. He has served and advised the many presidents and other policymakers who have had the good sense to seek out his advice. Graham will be interviewed by Amy Selico. Amy is a principal of Albright Stonebridge Group. She previously served as Senior Director for China Affairs at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, as well as in the Departments of State and Commerce. There is an old joke that goes, how do you live to be 100? And the answer is live to be 99 and then be very, very careful. Well, our nation is not 99, but 241 years old. If we want to live to be 300, we must wisely and skillfully address the challenges posed by the rise of China. Fortunately for the United States, there are historical precedents from which we can learn. Fortunately for those of us in this room, we now have the privilege of hearing from a wise and experienced scholar and counselor who has studied carefully, thought deeply, and written eloquently about those precedents. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Graham Allison and Amy Selico.
Thank you. Thanks so much, David, and thanks to the Chicago Council for welcoming me here. I am honored, in fact, to be interviewing you, Graham, on this book. That means so much to those of us who do spend day in and day out watching China. While you have written that Destined for War, of course, is not a book about China, but a book about the impact of a rising China on the United States and on the world. All of us have watched over the past 2 years as conversations about U.S.-China relations increasingly include what to do to avoid Thucydides Trap, thanks to the contribution that you've made for us China watchers and America watchers all over China, and what we have to do to accommodate a rising and a ruling power shift in our world. I reside in Washington, D.C., and earlier this week I was speaking at my own alma mater, Johns Hopkins, about rising tensions in U.S.-China relations. And I was joined at SAIS speaking with David Lampton and a leading Chinese academic from the China Institute for Contemporary International Relations, KICR, that we know very well, Dr. Cui Ru. And the three of us were talking about what the US and China need to do to avoid threats and an increasing probability of war. I was very interested that Dr. Cui made his remarks about this title, that the post-American era has arrived, and China is asking that the United States accommodate China's rising power as US power declines. I have to say, I don't believe Dr. Lampton and I shared those views. And in my remarks about US-China economic relations, what I work on every day, I talked about the rising threat of protectionism in Washington and in Beijing, leading to the likelihood of increased conflict in the economic realm. Dr. Lampton talked not only about that threat, but about the fact that the United States and China don't seem willing in Washington and in Beijing to talk about accommodation and to talk about this new era. And that leads us to more rather than less threat in the global environment. I'd like to turn to you now to help us explain the predicament that we're currently in, where one another are trusting each other less and less, and more seemingly fearful about the future. So, Dr. Allison, if you could just please start us off with the premise of this book, Destined for War, and really, is China and the United States, are we headed for war?
So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here in Chicago. I thank the Chicago Council, David, a colleague whom I've known for a long time, and Amy, whom I haven't actually met before, but I've read and know about, and we've had some conversations. So it's an honor for me to be here. So I am not a China expert. Actually, I only came to China as a topic, in the last dozen years, where I've generally focused on American national security, and therefore during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. So I'm a proud veteran Cold Warrior. I'm glad that we won. I worked hard at the end of the Soviet Union for the next phase, in the Clinton administration in particular, trying to wrap up the nuclear weapons that were left all around the former Soviet Union. So that's been my focus. But about a dozen years ago, when I was beginning to prepare to do a book on Lee Kuan Yew, the founder and builder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew said, yeah, I understand that, yeah, but you should pay more attention to China. So I said, well, China is big, it has a long history, I can't even remember what all the dynasties are. This would be, I don't speak the language. I can't do that. He said, you should pay more attention to China. And my old professor at Harvard, whom I remain his teaching assistant 50 years later, Henry Kissinger, kept saying to me, China, Graham, you should pay more attention to China. So little by little, I began to try to, to think about it. And in the course of trying to think about it, first I recognized what a fantastically large, complicated topic this is. No way in the world I'm going to learn Mandarin at this stage. I've had the good fortune to have some excellent Chinese students. And, if you've been interested in general in China as part of it, well, I began digging on the problem. And in the course of that, I somehow, something clicked. And I remembered what I had learned a long time ago from Thucydides about what happens when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. So Thucydides Trap, a term I coined, but an idea, which was a Thucydides idea, is that it's the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. So as a first approximation, when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, poop happens. So Thucydides wrote about classical Greece, the rise of Athens, which was challenging Sparta, which had ruled Greece for 100 years. I have a good chapter in the book on World War I and the rise of Germany and its impact on Britain 125 years ago in the roll in to World War I. And as I tried to think about China and what was happening in its relationship with the US today, it seemed to me this sort of is reminiscent of the pattern. So in this book, I then looked back at the last 500 years of history. So this book took 5 years of really pretty serious work. And I found 16 cases, starting at the end of the 15th century with the rise of Portugal and its impact, the rise of Spain and its impact on Portugal, which was the dominant sea power at the time, before Columbus, and stretching to the rise of Germany as the dominant power in Europe in the post-Cold War era. I found of those 16 cases, 12 ended in war, 4 in not war. So Thucydides has this famous line that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable. So I explained in the book my understanding that this really was hyperbole. Thucydides only meant very likely, not 100%. And that on the historical record, that's not an exaggeration. So a couple of more points if I could. So the dynamic, as Thucydides explains it, is generally not that Amy is the ruling power, I'm the rising power, and I've now gotten to be almost as strong as she is, and I think it's a good time to fight her. Or alternatively, that you become fearful of me, the rising power, and say, better to fight him today than tomorrow, because tomorrow he's going to be stronger. So you could imagine that happening. There's a couple of cases in which something like that almost happened. But generally, and Thucydides' idea, is that what happens is in this dangerous dynamic, a third party's action. In the case of Athens and Sparta, it was Corinth, which was an ally of Sparta, which got into a haggle with Corcyra. In World War I, it was the assassination of an archduke who didn't really matter to anybody, except his father, the Austro-Hungarian emperor, which dragged everybody into a war. And in the current situation with the US and China, I think the dangers arise not that somebody in China thinks war with the US is a good idea, because I don't believe there's anybody in China who thinks that's a good idea. And I don't think there's anybody in Washington that thinks war with China would be anything other than crazy. But under those circumstances, could Kim Jong-un, with his antics, force or lead the US to do something? For example, attacking North Korea, which President Trump has said he will do if that's his only option, to prevent Kim Jong-un acquiring an ability to strike San Francisco with a nuclear weapon. And if he were to do that, what will we do? And then what will North Korea do? And then what will China do? And most Americans forget. But I was in Beijing about, 8 weeks ago, talking to people there about Thucydides Trap, where there's Xi Jinping talks about it a lot and has tried to mobilize the whole community to think about it. And I asked at the PLA Academy with the senior colonels, I said, could North Korea drag the US and China into war? And one young colonel said, absolutely not. He said, there's nobody in their right mind thinks war between the US and China could make sense. So I said, well, I had learned that the Chinese study history a lot, and did anybody else have a view? So the senior colonel raised his hand. He said, of course they could. They already did. In 1950, China did not want a war with the US. Excuse me, Mao was just 1 year after consolidating control of the mainland. So the idea of attack Superman 5 years after World War II, that's crazy. And MacArthur thought it was crazy. He couldn't believe it. That's why it was such a surprise. The US didn't want a war with China. We had decided we're not going to fight China. That would be crazy. But North Korea attacked South Korea. US came to the rescue of South Korea, pushed the North Koreans right back up the peninsula, crossed the 38th parallel, and were moving rapidly to unify Korea. Out of the blue, China jumped into the war. 300,000 troops attacked MacArthur. Another 500,000 followed, pushed the U.S. right back down to the 38th parallel, where we had to settle for an armistice. 50,000 Americans were killed in that war, most of them by Chinese. 1 million Chinese were killed, most of them by Americans. Several million Koreans. So, well, they did once, so of course they could. Now the question is, could they do this again? And my argument in the book is not if we were sane and we're sitting down like adults and saying, wait a minute, you don't want to fight me, I don't want to fight you. If we were to end up in a war, it would be catastrophic for both of us. So do not let this little guy pull us somewhere where we don't want to go. Now, what can we do about it? And I try in the book to identify 5 plausible paths from where we are now to war in order to help us look at them and think about them and discuss them with Chinese like adults and say, okay, well, what do we have to do not to allow this to cause us to go somewhere? And North Korea is the most dangerous. Yeah.
And I think throughout your book, and certainly at the end, as you're thinking about what do we do about this potential likelihood from third-party outside factors,
Right.
What does the United States and China have to actually build today in order to avoid the outcome of conflict? Because we are going to continue to have tensions between ourselves as well as externalities that we can't control. And I think it was quite interesting that you did talk about ways to accommodate one another and also ways to build cooperative goals. Where do those stand, do you think, today? Where can the United States and where do we share goals, and how will that help us to avoid conflict?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I apologize for such long answers, but let me just make 3 or 4 points. So first, if we continue business as usual, we should expect history as usual. So, and I would characterize the last 20 years of U.S. policy towards China, both under Democrats and Republicans, as essentially business as usual. So keep doing what we're doing. This is going not turn out well, I believe. But I also argue in the book that, as Santayana taught us, only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So there's no obligation to make the same mistakes over. We can learn from the other lessons. So now if we look at the lessons, and I try, the next to the last chapter of the book has 12 lessons for peace, or 12 clues for peace, extracted from the 16 cases, both the failures and the successes. So the case that I find most helpful is the Cold War. But the second case I find most helpful is the rise of the U.S. at the beginning of the 20th century to basically rival and then overshadow Britain. So in the Cold War case, again, there's a good chapter on that for those that are interested. It's hard to remember how remarkable the strategy was that was invented in the late 1940s. I mean, it's breathtaking. And it reflected and captured a burst of strategic imagination that I think is one of the shining stars of all of diplomatic history, forever, for all of recorded in that history. So a country that had just barely got through War 46, Kennan writes back to Truman, this famous long telegram, and says, the Soviet Union is now a bigger existential threat to the U.S. than the Nazis were. Truman says, what? You know, this person must be out of his mind. We have just finished a war against the Nazis. We're exhausted. We've spent our money. We're bringing our troops home. Don't tell me about some other dragon out there. Forget about it yet. So over a period of 4 years of complicated conversation, we ended up developing a strategy that included the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was completely crazy as an idea. Here you are in 1947, and George Marshall comes to Harvard, gives a speech at commencement. He says, I have a good idea. Why don't we tax Americans now, year and a half after the war, take 1.5% of GDP and send it to the Europeans to help rebuild them, including the Germans, who were just killing us. You know, if you said something like that today, you would be pushed right out of Washington. I mean, so basically a huge amount of imagination. NATO, George Washington told us, stay away from entangling alliances. And we did, successfully, for a long, long time. NATO commits us, by Article 5, to regard an attack on one of these crazy Europeans as an attack on us. And we put our troops there to defend it. What? Okay, so we really just fantastic. In any case, we did have a strategy. We had an economic pillar. The whole idea of the international financial system is, as Amy knows better than anybody. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank and GATT, the trading system, all of that was part of this overall strategy, and it was pursued for 4 decades. And in the end, the Soviet Union disappeared, and we won. I was working for Reagan enthusiastically. I think it was the victory over the evil empire was a great thing. So, have Americans ever done anything like this? Yes, they have. So that's, if I take the earlier case about accommodation, again, in Washington today and in American politics, accommodation has become like a, oh my God, a third rail word. It's like compromise. You know, can you compromise? Well, excuse me, if there's a negotiation between 2 parties who don't, neither of them can force the other one to agree, as Ronald Reagan pointed out repeatedly, you have to settle for half a loaf rather than no loaf. Then you can go back and try to pursue the other half loaf. So this is not a crazy idea. It's just kind of become politically dubious. But if China becomes bigger and stronger, and actually, as I explained in the book, for those that haven't noticed, China has a GDP today bigger than the American GDP. Let me say it again. China's economy today is larger than the American economy, measured by what both the IMF and the CIA judge as the single best yardstick for comparing national economies, namely purchasing power parity. So go to the CIA website and look it up, and you'll see. You will not read this in the New York Times. You won't read this in the Wall Street Journal, because we don't like this. That's not, but in any case, if China's bigger and stronger, lo and behold, one's gonna have to sort of adapt and adjust. And that may include, quote, accommodating. So I would say, if we look at Taiwan, actually, operationally, the US has been extremely accommodating. But that was the price of basically getting an opening to China and then relations with China. We used to say the government in Taipei was the government of China, and we had a defense treaty with them. China said, if that's your posture, no business with us. So first Nixon, Kissinger, and then Carter said, okay, we'll pay that price. Now, we didn't say that out loud. We just stood up with some other, more, I think, palatable language, but that's what actually happened. And now we recognize Beijing as the government of China. So I would say that probably gives us a clue to the fact that we're at least capable, with a little art, of adapting and adjusting. And if you look in the case of the US and Britain, if we go back to Amy and I were having a conversation a couple of days ago. So the American behavior as we grew to become bigger and stronger and rival Britain is breathtaking. I have a chapter that most Americans will not like, in which I read the developments of this through the eyes of Teddy Roosevelt, who's one of my heroes. Okay. So Teddy Roosevelt went to Washington in 1897 to become the #2 person in the Department of the Navy. He was 37 years old. He had been saying for 15 years that having foreigners in our hemisphere, especially Spanish in Cuba, where they were occupied, was an abomination. So in the decade that followed 1897, when Teddy arrived, what happened? First, a mysterious explosion on the ship in Havana Harbor, which we took as an occasion to declare war in Spain. And we liberated Cuba, we took Puerto Rico, we picked up Guam as a spoil of war. We then supported and sponsored a coup in Colombia, created a whole new country, Panama, which the next day gave us a contract for a canal that Teddy wanted to build so his ships could get from the Atlantic to Pacific. We then threatened war, first with Germany, then with Britain, unless they butted out of a territorial dispute in Venezuela. And then we actually stole the biggest part of the fat tail of Alaska from Canada. And then, he announced the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that said if any government in our hemisphere behaves in a way we don't like, we will send the Marines and change the government. And every year that followed for the next decade, we send the Marines somewhere and change some government. So rising powers can be very full of themselves and exuberant and abusive even to the ruling power. Now the British were brilliant in understanding, I believe, and I think is a big clue for us here, they made a distinction between what they thought was vital for Britain and what was simply vested, which was the way things had been. So they thought vital for Britain was Canada as a colony, as part of the empire. So this was when the sun never set on the British Empire. They had India, South Africa, Canada. Canada was very important too. And they were afraid Teddy Roosevelt might even seize Canada. I mean, he looked at it. I think he was particularly interested in Vancouver and the territory around there. But on the other hand, was it vital for them to be patrolling the seas in the Caribbean or just settling a territorial dispute in Venezuela? No. So they adapted and adjusted, and they did so artfully that by the time this was over, Americans saw their interests as largely aligned with the British. Mm-hmm. So then when World War I came in 1914, the U.S. didn't enter the war, but we became the lifeline to Britain for supplies and for finance. And then when we entered the war in 1917, we entered as their ally. And if we hadn't, they wouldn't have won. And in the interwar years, we became even more thickly entangled. And when World War II came, again, we were their vital ally. So I think the notion that where nations share important national interests, they might be able to understand and work to cooperate in the areas which are vital for them, and to adapt and adjust and accommodate in areas that are less important, that at least we have a good set of lessons there. And I think in the Chinese-American case, as you said, there's a lot of vital common space to work on. Yeah.
I think I'm just picking up on that, thinking about the Soviet U.S. example and U.S. Britain, and of course China is somewhere in between those as we look at our relationship as strategic competitors in the world today. Where are our vital interests not aligning? And so I think in your book you talk about non-proliferation, economic interdependence, as well as climate change and the goal to combat it as three aligned interests.
Vital interests, yeah.
They may be vitally important, but let's take the first one as an example, non-proliferation. I think we're not aligned today. I think if you ask China, and it was interesting in your book, when you asked an academic, what should the United States do about its presence in the Asia Pacific? I think the response was, butt out.
Butt out, yeah.
Get out of the Asia Pacific. From the US perspective, and I think from our allies' perspective, our increased integration in the region is actually a stabilizing factor. And so on non-proliferation alone, right there, you've got, obviously the United States and China don't want a nuclear North Korea, but our interests vitally aligned in preventing that from happening. I think that the United States and China veer into different categories there when talking about that. On economic interdependence, of course, our trade and investment relationship with China is incredibly deep. Our economies are incredibly interconnected. But I would say so are our differences today, not just because we don't follow one another's rules, but because China is looking to set different rules. And I think one part of that may be enhance protectionism in Washington and in Beijing. And so again, a vital interest, economic interconnectedness. Right now, I think we're struggling with that. And then climate change, I mean, China has been very clear, you're not going to continue in the Trump administration to pursue the Paris Agreement? No problem. We'll go it alone. Cooperation isn't necessary. And so in this environment in 2017, and again, I think Beijing and Washington, D.C. have domestic interests that may be pulling us apart rather than looking at the commonalities.
Okay,
what do we do now?
Very well said. So, and I would say what Amy's done is driven us down to another level of the nuance in the situation. So let me go back one step and then I'll come there. So from a 30,000 foot level looking at the picture, it would say about the US and China, first with respect to nuclear war, they have a essential, vital national interest in that China has now acquired a nuclear arsenal that gives it a mutual assured destruction capability, which means that if I attack them and do my best to disarm them, they can still destroy me. So in that case, the decision to attack you is suicidal for me, and that creates huge caution. That's what we learned with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and that was a bedrock. So I would say that is right. The second thing is, in economics, as a first, again, at the first level, with about a $600 billion trade, and with China holding whatever it is now, $1.5 trillion of our debt, if we were to have a war, Walmarts would be empty, and Chinese factories would be producing for who? And where would we get a loan for our deficit? So, you know, we have at least at the broad some very significant shared interests. Similarly, with respect to climate, even though China's talking about going it alone if we're retreating from the field, it's simply a fact. It's not believed by everybody in the country, but I think it's a fact that if we keep emitting greenhouse gases as we're now doing, and China does nothing, so they reduce to zero, we still have a climate for all of us we can't live in 100 years, and vice versa. So if we quit emitting any greenhouse gases today, and China just keeps doing what isn't. So unless the two parties, the two principal emitters, can find a way to work together on this, there's just no solution. Now that doesn't mean that, and Paris was a very, I think, modest, small step down that path. So that's at kind of 30,000 feet. Now coming down to the next level, which is, I think, very, very powerful. With respect to proliferation, I think when I talk to Chinese security people, if I say, what do you think about a South Korean nuclear weapon? No, terrible. What do you think about a Japanese nuclear weapon? No, terrible. I say to them, have you even played the game of what it looks like if you have a nuclear China, a nuclear India, and a nuclearizing South Korea, a nuclear North Korea, and a nuclearizing South Korea, and a nuclearizing Japan, just in the current geopolitics. And that looks to me like not stable deterrence, but like a five-sided monster that could easily get out of control, and you could see a local nuclear war. And I've said to Chinese, that's better than a global nuclear war, as far as I'm concerned. That is, as long as it's there, not here. But it's also crazy. Millions and millions of people would be killed, and a lot of Americans, and the world. I mean, this would change the world more than any other war has ever changed the world if it was only, quote, only just a local nuclear war. So they should be more concerned about that than they are. They go back and forth on this. On the one hand, they don't want Japan and South Korea to have nuclear weapons. On the other hand, they don't want us there in the region. So that's where it's competitive. And I think in the economic framework that we've operated with has worked fairly well from their perspective, as you say, because they have the most mercantilist, protectionist economy, big economy in the world. And they operate it to their advantage. And we've somehow allowed them to get away with it, I would say. Now, Trump may exaggerate in some respects in this regard, but I think the whole sense of that has been rising over the last decade or two as people have looked and said, wait a minute, they, as opposed to becoming more responsible as they become stronger, they're becoming more exploitive, more predatory. Now, in fact, that's exactly what a monopolist or oligopolist will do in a market if he's only looking after his interests. So why do we have to have antitrust laws within the US? Because if I could get away with being a monopolist, that would be my preferred option. And many companies have sought that. So, and most companies behave as badly as they can get away with, I would say. Okay? So if you look at Microsoft and its treatment of small competitors, or Google, or Oracle, if you want a sharp case, it's only if they are afraid of being sued, or when they're sued, that they're constrained. That's why we have laws. So I would say the default position is parties pursuing their narrow interests behave as badly as they can get away with. Well, China has demonstrated that pretty well, and I would say we're seeing that over a range of things. So there's going to be significant pushback there, which threatens the broader set of economic interests. And you struggle in that space every day. And I think in the climate space, nobody was more surprised than Xi Jinping when Mrs. Merkel termed him, when he came and visited in Germany recently, and said, "You're the leader of the green, climate-friendly revolution." And he sort of looked, you know, it was one of those looks you can see sometimes on people's face, and thinking, what, maybe there's a joke or something. Mrs. Merkel doesn't make jokes. So he looking, thinking, I am the biggest polluter in the world. I know that, that's our economy. We're the biggest greenhouse gas emitter. And we're committed to burning coal for as long as we can. That's our program. And you're saying, I'm the leader of this green, well, if you think so, okay, I'm perfectly happy. It was like the speech he gave in Davos in January, which was, again, one of these moments where it's just hard to believe. So we had, Trump had been elected. U.S. was not going forward with TPP, the Asian Trade Agreement, or the European, TTIP, the European Trade Agreement. And so the leaders he met with there said, well, so you're the leader, China has to be the leader of the liberal, international, rule-based economic system. And a person whom I know well, who works for him, said, they were thinking, what? So they said, yep, and you're going to give a speech. And he said, they'd know, we are the most mercantilistic big economy in the world. We're the most protectionist. We're not going to change. But if you say I'm the leader, I can give that speech. So they worked hard. They gave a brilliant speech. None of it they believe, I think. None of it. So I think this is, I think you're on to the fact that the areas of tension will get larger. And then in addition, and I think the main areas of tension will come over first China's desire to stand up and be China, the same way Teddy Roosevelt's America was standing up to be America. So we believe, and I believe, that America's position as the predominant power in Asia has been the best thing that ever happened to Asia, and has been the foundation for 7 decades of peace in Asia, and a framework, both economic and political, that has enabled Asian countries to have the Asian miracles. And nobody has benefited more from this than China. So you would say, well, gee, this order, you never saw something better than this. This is a great order. You should be happy with this order. And we even have tried to explain to them, I mean, you should actually share responsibility for this order. You should even help pay for it. You should help sustain it. And I think they say, well, that was then and now is now. So why don't you butt out and we'll manage this space. And I don't think we're going anywhere. So I think the question of how that will play is very hard. And then you see vivid examples of it, as in case of the North Korean now.
I'd like to open this up to questions, but before I do, I just want to sort of set a framework of today, October 13th. As everybody in this room knows, of course, we're all waiting for China's Party Congress to begin next week.
Right.
And we, many of us anticipate, of course, that President Xi Jinping is going to consolidate power in a way that hasn't been seen in the recent past and will allow President Xi to continue to focus on making China great again and really achieving this Chinese dream for its own citizenry. I think that's great for China. I think China taking on the mantle of globalization could be very positive if China does start to believe what it says. Like you said, I think they're at the beginning stage of that. But one final question from me is a strong leader like President Xi Jinping an inhibitor to avoiding conflict between the United States and China, or could he actually help lead the United States through this very challenging transition if China continues to rise and the United States must meet China as an equal power?
Fantastic question. So again, I wish I knew the answer. So I think the first thing Amy said, let me underline, because for those of you that have not been watching China, by this time next week, you'll be watching. So next Wednesday opens this Party Congress. My prediction is that Xi Jinping will be coronated, the new emperor. Okay? So he's going to be the leader of China, not just for the next 5 years, but with a runway that has no determined end. Okay? He will be recognized as the strongest leader of China since Mao. He's known by Chinese, they call him sometimes, he's not the CEO of China, he's the COE, the chief of everything. And this is a remarkable man. If you want a profile of him, I think I have about as good a profile as you'll get in 4 or 5 pages in the book, which comes largely from tutorials from Lee Kuan Yew, whom he knew very well, or knew him very well. And his program is the most ambitious of any program of any leader in the country, any country today. He's running 4 simultaneous revolutions, and each one of them would be more than any reasonable person would undertake. So I think he's got his hands more than full. One of the revolutions is to restore Chinese nationalism, to revive Chinese nationalism and restore pride in being Chinese by China standing up and being more assertive. So that in itself requires, as one of my friends there says, not allowing the Philippines to jerk us around or something. So wherever anybody pushes back, they want to say, no, no, no. And if he were to overdo that, in part, he's more reasonable. I mean, if you do as you know better than I do, if you look at the young people's conversation on Chinese social media, they are way, way, way more assertive, way more nationalistic, much more extreme than the government is. So in some sense, he's, he's awakened a tiger. Now he gotta ride it. Yeah.
And I think, one of the questions we have in the United States is, will this very strong leader also be willing to accommodate the United States as we need to accommodate China in this changing reality? The jury's out.
I think the jury's out, and I think we're all on the edge of our chairs.
Exactly.
Yes.
I'd love to open this up to people. Yes, sir, in the front row.
Professor Allison. Very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a question because you've written about this, and I believe it's in your book, and I've seen your interviews and written a lot of stuff you've been talking about lately. One of the things you talked about, I wrote down a note to myself that you said that Washington, D.C. right now, the Congress, the government, is in a kind of a form of shell shock because of this. The rise of China has been so sudden, so powerful, that the United States government's a bit off balance. And I was wondering if you could provide some examples of when you were talking to officials in Washington, D.C., and you realized looking at their face that there was a mixture of confusion and fear. Because I worked in Congress when Paul Kennedy came down with his book in 1987, somewhat similar to your book and everything. And I remember he came out of a committee hearing meeting, and I looked at him, and we were talking. I said, "Did anybody listen to you?" And he said everybody had this whole preconceived ideas in their head, and he didn't know if he, connected with them at all. So I was wondering if you could maybe give an example of talking to officials and realizing they don't get it.
Well, thank you. You're a good reader of the book, and you captured a big idea. So for those of you who haven't been watching China Space, I try to capture in 20 pages, the first chapter, The Rise of China, just a jolt. And I quote Czech President Václav Havel, whom I think got the right idea. He said, "All this has happened so fast, we haven't yet had time to be astonished." So basically, most people haven't caught up with it, have not caught up with it. As an example, in the book on the impact of the rise of China on the U.S., I offer a cartoon which I made for the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2014. So Jack Reed, who's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Services Committee, was a student of mine at Harvard 20 years ago. And he said, "Graham, we want you to provide some context for looking at the defense budget in Asia. So you've been working on this thing. Why don't you testify about it?" But he said, "You got to make it simple." So I worked very hard. I gave him 10 pages that I thought was lucid. Okay? He said, "Graham, excuse me." I said, simple, and short. Okay? So how short? He said, "Short." Okay? So I worked hard, got it down to 3 pages. He said, no, that's too much. Okay. So I said, you maybe not going to have, but 5 minutes before people start talking to you. So I said, okay, and I made a cartoon, literally. So you'll see there. So I said, imagine a kid's schoolyard with a seesaw, and China's sitting on one end of the seesaw, and the U.S. is on the other end. And this is 2004. This was in 14 when I testified. So in 2004, and the size of the two is the size of their GDP. Okay? So 2004, China is like this, and it's 20% the size of U.S. 2014, China is about as big as the U.S. And 2024, 40% larger. So the cartoon is in the book. Okay? So when I said, what is it that you guys are debating? The Obama's administration big initiative in Asia, it's called the pivot. What was the pivot? We're going to put less weight on our left foot in the Middle East in order to be able to put more weight on our right foot. I said, that's a good idea and aspiration, but we should notice that while we're having this debate, our feet have just lifted off the ground. And McCain, who's the chairman of the committee, said, what? Just like that, after I showed the cartoon. And I said, I'd said anything over again. He said, nobody told me this, okay? So afterwards we were talking about it, and he said, I don't believe these numbers, okay? I just don't believe so. So I said, well, I'm just telling you these are CIA numbers for China-US purchasing power parity. He said, well, but people would have told us about this if this was happening like that. And I said, yeah, we probably should have done. We should have probably been looking at it. Again, I give in the book, and I've done this for senators and congressmen as well, I have a quiz that I give to my students at Harvard. Okay? So these are pretty smart kids. 26 indicators. The title of it is, when could China become number one? Biggest manufacturing country, largest number of billionaires, biggest maker of smartphones, computers, supercomputers, fastest supercomputers, AI research. So they judged 2030, 2040, not in my lifetime. Okay. Then I give them chart 2, and it says already. So all those 26 things have already happened. And people, what? No, they cannot have the fastest supercomputer. Last year in the contest, they won 4 of the top 5 places. Well, they certainly can't have artificial intelligence that challenges us. I don't know if you saw in the paper yesterday, day before, Alibaba is just committing $15 billion. This is a company, $15 billion to AI research. That's more than we spend at the Defense Department. So I would say that, be astonished.
Yes, sir.
I like to read a book of another Harvard professor, Dwight Perkins.
Yes.
And Dwight
One of
turned
my
out,
teachers and neighbors, yes.
that's right, Dwight's a great guy. He's from Chicago, by the way. His father's a famous architect here in Chicago.
Oh, great.
However, he came out with a book in 2012, basically putting out, at least arguing, that the Chinese economy is going to be in decline in 4 to 5 years. We see here, you mentioned the mercantilist effect in China, which is true of Korea and Japan, all of Asia as well, and that the mercantilist idea is not a long-term program for sustained economic growth. Japan has been in stagnation now for almost 15 years. South Korea is going in that direction. And in Dwight's book, he sees a similar effect in China. I mean, all the manufacturing is now going to Southeast Asia. Also, we're going to be seeing growth in Southeast Asia plus India. So in 5 to 10 years, we might be saying similar things about India and Southeast Asia that you're now saying about China.
It's a very good question. So Dwight is one of my colleagues, friends, teachers. He and I live just 3 houses apart on the same street, so and we talk often. I like his book, but I disagree with it. Larry Summers and I run a China working group of which Dwight is a member. It consists mostly of people who know something about China, and then folks like Larry and me who are interested, but enjoy learning from our colleagues. And Larry has been bearish about China for the past decade on the proposition that it cannot continue growing at this super high rate, and that it has to regress to the mean. That's his argument, like everybody else has. And I've been bearish on China over the past decade, and so for each year, the past decade at least, I've won. That doesn't mean the future. Secondly, as you know, Herb Stein, the famous old chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, had a great line that said, "A trend that cannot continue forever won't." Okay? So I proposed to him once the Allison footnote, which is that it's much easier to predict that something will happen than when. So if I go to the doctor and he says, "Graham, you're going to die," I say, I think I knew this, okay? When? Have you got any ideas about when? So when is this going to change? So if I look at it, and I've tried to look at it and tried to think about it, and I discussed this in the book, I think you're trying to bet about the competence of a government and its ability to adapt and adjust to very, very powerful circumstances. And if I look at the government and the way that it adapts and adjusts, and particularly at the period since with the great financial crisis and recession, this has been remarkable, a remarkable team. And they've adapted and adjusted ruthlessly. They keep control of enough instruments that they're able to do more things than others. So I would bet, but again, this is uncertain, that over the next decade, I don't see why they won't grow 3 times our rate. We've been barely scraping 2% a year, and I think they'll scrape 6% a year. And if you let one economy grow at 6% and one at 2%, we can all do those numbers and see the way that things diverge. So, but it's quite possible, if you look at the list of problems that they have, I mean, nobody has more problems than China. Right. But the Chinese leadership has been very forthright in recognizing those problems and trying to find ways to cope with them. So when they begin to see it, when they begin to appreciate the one-child policies, its impact on the demographic problem, so they relax the one-child policy. When they They now are it's a big item for them. That you can't breathe the air a lot of days in Beijing. That's crazy. Nobody's going to live in a place where they can't breathe. And so their families and their children tell them, this is nuts. So they're changing this, and I think they will. But whether they'll be successful, I think there's no guarantee.
Just make a quick point. In the financial press last week, there been a number of articles about the growing problem of a heavily indebted financial system.
That's right.
Their
Right.
banking system could go bust. And that's a much, much more difficult problem to solve.
Big problem.
You
but
could
if
have 1997 all over again, but in a much bigger, much bigger scope.
I would read Marty Feldstein on the topic, and I think Marty's he's a member of this same group. And as he points out, almost all the money is owed to themselves, so not to somebody else. And also that the Chinese government has shown a great capacity for taking those problems and capturing them, dealing with them, more effectively than we did actually with the savings and loans. But again, it's a big issue.
There's been a lot of, I think the government has focused exactly on the issue that you're talking about because they have to. Obviously, they've started to really promote services to compensate for decreased manufacturing for exactly the reasons you said. But that challenge that you're talking about with public debt is one I think the government, after this leadership transition, when it regroups with this consolidated leadership, I think that will be among the first things they try to deal with. And in a parallel way, also with financial liberalization to try to help the economy continue to grow.
I agree.
They recognize those challenges exist.
If I just give one more footnote, since I'm here in Chicago, the Paulson Institute does a great job of examining these. I was with Evan at the University of Chicago event earlier today, and if you go to their website, that Macro Polo, they've got a good account of, a good graphic account of the 8 areas of reforms and what's been done and what hasn't been done. That suggests, first, that they have huge problems, just as you say, but secondly, that on a number of them they've made huge progress, that a number of them they've had kind of on hold. Everything is just this last recent period, everything hard has been on hold as Xi is consolidating his position of power. But I'm betting that after this coronation, they're going to come out of the blocks and you're going to see a lot of activity and a lot of movement on some of the very hard issues. And one of the things they've done very carefully, artfully, I would say, in the anti-corruption drive is restore the party's position as a dominant, as the vanguard, and restored a backbone of fear through the whole society that everybody's vulnerable, and therefore opposition is dangerous. So, I mean, here, General Fang, who's the military equivalent of General Dumford, he's the person Dumford met with our chairman of the JCS last month when he went up to China. Mm-hmm. Fang, who was supposed to get promoted to the Politburo at this meeting, has been airbrushed out. So you can't find him.
I'm afraid that this hour has really gone by more quickly than I thought, and we're running out of time. As we think about the U.S. and China going forward, I think so many of the things you talked about today are going to continue to be important to us as observers of China. After the Party Congress, what will we see China start to tackle with this consolidated leadership that President Xi will lead? I'll just point to the statistics you were sharing with Senator McCain. When you look at the Chinese economy in 2004, compared with today and then compared with 2024, China's accession to the World Trade Organization, its openness to the global economy really is what drove that incredible growth story of China. And one question at least I have as I'm looking at China going forward from now is, will there be the same amount of openness among China's leadership to the world, or will China try to find its own way and try to control the economy and control the way that it behaves on the global stage. I think Xi Jinping and China has every right as a global power to chart its own course. But I'm concerned as I look at Graham's book one more time, Destined for War, will there be repercussions of a strong China if the United States and other global powers aren't strong enough to meet some of what President Xi is looking at?
I think you've stated the question just perfectly, and I think that as the U.S. will certainly be pushing back much harder on violation of trade rules, on requirements for companies to share technology if they're going to do business in China, on theft of intellectual property, so there's a whole arena of areas where you're going to see China facing on allowing China to buy American companies in especially important, future areas. And the Europeans are now looking at this and thinking, wait a minute. And even the Israelis, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, showed up, and he's a visiting fellow at Harvard last week. And as he says, that before 90% of the VC money in Israel was American Jews or Israeli. 80% of it is now Chinese money. And he's watching them do their VC investment and then buy Israeli tech companies because they can't buy the equivalent in Silicon Valley because Sisyphus is constraining them. So I would say if and as they find more pushback in the world, which I suspect they will do, now they're going to be faced with a more difficult dilemma.
Please join me in thanking Graham for sharing with us these insights today. Really enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I know that Graham is going to be signing some books over here, so please get in line.